Welcome, everybody. Great to see you. Um, welcome to this TDL-hosted webinar entitled OJS Accessibility for Journal Managers and Editors. My name is Christy Park. I'm the Executive Director of the Texas Digital Library, and I'm delighted to be joining this meeting from Austin today. I hope all of you will say hello and introduce yourselves in chat if you'd like to, and let us know where you're joining from as well. We are recording this webinar and we'll share the recording along with slides with all the registrants afterwards. We'll also be posting the recording on our YouTube channel and it'll be available publicly there. I'm joined today by several members of TDL's OJS Accessibility Working Group. And they are Mark Baggett, Director of Digital Collections in the University Libraries at Texas A&M, Alexa Height, Assistant Director for Research and Data Services at Texas State University, Susan Hoover, Metadata Services Coordinator at the University of Houston, and Michelle McCrary, Head of Digital Initiatives at Sam Houston State. These folks, as part of this working group, the working group formed earlier this year to develop accessibility resources for editors and managers of TDL-hosted open access journals. And it recently published an OJS accessibility toolkit in the TDL Wiki. This toolkit is designed to support journal managers and editors using Open Journal Systems, or OJS, in creating accessible websites and journal content. It includes guidance on web accessibility laws and standards, best practices for designing accessible OJS websites, suggested policies, including some policy templates, guidance for accessible manuscript preparation, and recommended resources and evaluation tools. And so we'll be drawing from this toolkit for much of the content in today's webinar, and we invite you to continue using it as a resource for your editorial teams going forward. And we'll put a link to it in chat. I also, as an aside, just want to note that that wiki contains a growing number of resources for journal managers and editors, so it's a good resource to know about and bookmark for your use. This is our agenda for today's presentation. We'll start with some background on Title II of the Americans with Disabilities Act, or ADA, and the importance of web accessibility generally, as well as the TDL Open Access Journal Hosting Service. We'll talk about the core principles of accessibility and then move into the application of those principles for improving accessibility of web content in OJS and for building accessibility into your editorial workflows. We'll touch briefly on theme accessibility and wrap up by pointing you to some resources and fielding your questions. We'll hold the Q&A until the end of our prepared content, but feel free to add questions to chat at any point as you think of questions that you have. We'll be tracking those and we can address them when we get to the Q&A section. I want to emphasize here at the start that we're not providing legal advice about digital accessibility compliance in this webinar, but we do hope to provide you with some practical and actionable information about how you can improve the accessibility of your journals for all users, including users with disabilities. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Michelle McCrary at Sam Houston State to walk through some background information about the ADA and Title II.
All right, thanks, Christy. So yes, as she said, let's talk a little bit about what Title II of the ADA says. So getting into it, next slide, please. Under Title II of the Americans with Disabilities Act, state and local government entities must ensure all services, programs, and activities are accessible to people with disabilities. The recent update published on April 24th, 2024 now includes specifications for accessibility of digital content as well. So this applies to institutions like state colleges and universities, and it covers a wide variety of services, activities, and materials. So for the context of this presentation, That includes journal publishing on websites, mobile apps, and other digital platforms. Ensuring these platforms and their content are accessible isn't just best practice anymore, it's a legal requirement. So, what does the new rule say? It requires that state and local entities ensure their web content meets accessibility standards according to the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, specifically WCAG 2.1 Level AA, making it usable for people with disabilities, including those using assistive technologies like screen readers. A link to those standards has been shared in chat if you'd like to peruse them. And please note that this is the minimum requirement set by the new rule, but that individual institutions may decide to follow a higher level standard because there are higher levels in WCAG. Compliance deadlines. It depends on population size. And in the case of universities and colleges, the key factor is not just student enrollment, but the total population of the local communities that they serve. So for entities serving populations of 50,000 or more, the deadline to comply is 2 years from the rule's effective date. And then for smaller communities, the deadline is 3 years. So final compliance deadline for most of us here is April 24th, 2026, which is approximately 7 months from now. And while that may seem like a little way off, understanding and implementing accessibility work can take some time. So starting sooner than later is beneficial. So give yourselves a good pat on the back for arriving here today. Good job. So why is this important? First and foremost, accessibility, as I said, isn't just a recommendation anymore, it's the law. Failing to meet required accessibility standards could result in legal consequences, including complaints, investigations, potential lawsuits. Materials should be readily usable and accessible to everyone without them having to request an alternate version. So accessibility then needs to be built in from the start and not treated as an afterthought. Accessibility, or lack thereof, impacts a large percentage of our population. So according to the CDC, 29% of adults in the US have some form of disability, so approximately 1 in 3 people. And then if we look specifically at higher ed, about 21% of undergrad students and 11% of graduate students report having a disability. But it's important to note that not all students report disabilities to the university. So all of that is to say that it isn't a small subset of the population, it's a significant portion of the communities we serve. But beyond the legal requirements, making your websites and documents accessible isn't just the right thing to do. It helps make your work and the scholarly research your journals publish more impactful and future-proof. So accessible websites and documents reach a broader audience, including people who use screen readers and other assistive tech. Features like clear heading structure, image descriptions, or alt text also improve readability and document navigation for everyone. Accessibility helps increase the visibility and citations of your work and keeps you aligned with the expectations of journals and funding agencies. And it also supports collaboration, especially if people on your editorial teams or reviewers that you work with themselves rely on assistive tech. And then finally, properly structured documents are easier to find in search engines and adapt better to new platforms, which keeps your content usable over time. So accessible websites and content can also just support the success of your journals as well. All right, and with that, I pass it back to Christy.
Thanks, Michelle. So next, we're going to talk a little bit about TDL's journal hosting service and how we manage it and how that impacts our approach to digital accessibility. TDL operates as a membership consortium of primarily academic research libraries, and we provide infrastructure for open access to research. Among its other services, TDL provides hosting of the Open Journal Systems, or OJS, platform in order to facilitate no-fee open access publishing via our member libraries. We host approximately 90 OJS websites for 11 institutional members as part of this service. And we'll put a link to chat about to our OA journal hosting policy if you're interested. The service works through a collaborative service model in which three stakeholder groups work together to support each journal's success: the TDL staff, the member library, by which we mean a university library that is an institutional member of TDL, and the journal's editorial and management team. TDL provides hosting and technical support for the journal, and that includes providing a help desk where users can reach out directly for help with the journal site. And member institutions provide another important layer of support, serving as liaisons between the TDL and editorial teams and providing additional value-added publishing support services at their discretion. The journal's editorial and management teams, of course, are the hands-on folks managing the day-to-day operation of the journal, managing content, editorial workflows, and journal policy. This collaborative service model impacts the approach we take to ensuring the accessibility of our journal sites. So, like everything else, digital accessibility is a collaborative responsibility among TDL, its member institutions, and individual journal management and editorial teams. TDL is responsible for providing an accessible application interface, including one or more accessible interface themes, and the journal teams are responsible for making sure that their content is accessible and that they either choose an accessible theme or create custom themes that are accessibility compliant. We'll talk more about theme accessibility a little bit more later in the presentation, but for now, I just want to highlight that OJS's default theme has been audited for accessibility compliance by its developers at PKP, and many barriers to accessibility eliminated from it. Therefore, TDL highly recommends that you use the default theme in your journal. If you decide to customize that theme or use one of the alternate themes in OJS, you as the journal management and editorial team are responsible for that theme's compliance with accessibility guidelines. And we'll put a couple links in chat to information about the accessibility of that default theme and TDL's voluntary product accessibility template, which kind of outlines our compliance with accessibility guidelines related to OJS. Additionally, journal teams are responsible for making sure that the content they publish via OJS is accessible to users with disabilities. So when we're talking about content, we're talking about article files and supplementary files that get published as part of issues in OJS, and also other website content like the text and images added to policy pages or announcements. Throughout this presentation, we're going to dive deeper into specific things you need to do to make your journal accessible. But before we move more deeply into the how-tos, I want to preview our main recommendations to journal managers for moving towards greater accessibility of your sites and talk a little bit about why our focus is on some of these things. So, as I've already said, we highly recommend using the default theme. In terms of content accessibility, we recommend the following. We recommend that you add web accessibility requirements to your guidelines for authors and other journal policies, that you embed web accessibility checks and remediation into your editorial workflow, and that you incorporate basic web accessibility practice into the creation of any content on your site. And as I said, we'll be going into more detail on each of these in the following slides. We'll repeat this several times today, that accessibility starts with the author manuscript. And by that, I mean producing a published article that is WCAG compliant is much easier if you start out with an accessible manuscript or source document. So enlisting authors and best practices for accessibility at the start is really important. In assessing our hosted journals here at TDL, we can see that there's huge opportunity for improvement here. Nearly all of our hosted journals, 96%, provide at least minimal guidance to authors on submission preparation. So those author guidelines are there in most of our journals, but very few of them, only about 5%, provide any guidance at all about accessibility. So the good news here is that the mechanism of author guidelines exists in almost all of your journals for requiring authors to engage with the accessibility of their submitted manuscripts. And so we encourage journal teams to use that mechanism to enlist authors in this effort. And we'll talk more about author guidelines later on. Likewise, in one of the next sections, we'll be talking in more depth about embedding accessibility practice into the editorial workflow. And in that section, we're going to talk primarily about PDF accessibility and to a lesser extent about HTML. Though OJS supports other article formats like EPUB and XML, PDFs are overwhelmingly the format of choice in our hosted journal sites. And so we wanted to focus our attention on how to create accessible PDF documents. So with these things in mind, we're going to begin talking about digital accessibility principles and how to apply them in your OJS site. And I'm going to hand it over to Alexa Height.
Awesome. Thank you, Christy. I will be going over the POUR principles, which on our next slide, we have those spelled out, which are perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. So POUR is a foundational framework for web accessibility outlined in WCAG. It is an easy way to remember the four basic principles, websites, or other digital content like our PDFs that we're hosting that need in order to be accessible to everyone, including folks with disabilities. So, in order for our materials to be perceivable, information and user interface components must be presented in ways that users can perceive them. Content should be available to at least one of the user's senses, so sight, hearing, touch. Examples of this are text alternatives for images, braille text, captions for videos, and adaptable color contrast. So our example here, we have alt text. Simple alt text would be a line graph showing that enzyme activity increases with temperature, peaking at 37 degrees Celsius before declining sharply. But more in depth, alt text would be a long description providing information such as title, access labels, maximum and minimum values, our categories, key data, and any other trends. The data could be presented either as a table beneath the graph or in a long description format. This description should consider the purpose of the image for the users in its context of the content. And then for operable, user interface components and navigation must be operable. Users must be able to interact with all functionality using various input methods, keyboard, voice, etc. So our examples here are keyboard navigation, enough time for users to read or interact with the content, and we should never have content that might cause seizures for our users. For you, understandable information should be information and the operation of the user interface must be understandable. So content should be clear and predictable in its behavior and language. Examples for this is consistent navigation, clear and comprehensible text, and if you have error suggestions when filling out forms, that is understandable. And then our content should be robust. Content must be robust enough for users to be able to interpret it for a wide variety of user agents, including our assistive technologies. So content should work across our current, but also be adaptable for future tools, including screen readers and browsers. So an example of this, which we've already touched on, is well-structured HTML and appropriate use of accessible rich internet applications roles, which we will link to in the chat. So our example here shows an article structure with headings where the article title is the highest rank heading and the most important information of the article is available in the structure of the headings. Before I hand things back to Christy, just another reminder, as we've already talked about, that journal teams are responsible for their OJS sites and for the principles of POUR. So while OJS comes out of the box with accessibility, your OJS site depends on what you and your journal team do after installation. So any of that customization. And with that, I will hand it back to Christy. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Alexa. It's me again. And now that we've gone over the POUR principles, we'll start talking about putting those principles into practice. And in this section, we'll talk a little bit about the static content that you're adding to journals' web pages. So in this screenshot, you'll see a section of the journal settings that's in the OJS dashboard where you would enter a description of the journal that appears on the About the Journal page. This is probably fairly familiar looking to you. In the example here, you'll see I've added text to the description text box, also an image, and there's hyperlink text there as well. All of those elements need to be digitally accessible. So when adding any content like what I just showed, you'll want to, at minimum, make sure that you're doing all the things on this checklist. You'll want to make sure that any images have alt text or alternative text added, create descriptive hyperlinks, use hierarchical page structure, check your use of color, and check for the accessibility of any documents that you upload. So we'll go through each of these in a bit more detail, starting with alt text. So alternative text or alt text is a machine readable tag that describes an image in words if the image can't be displayed for any reason. And it's what a screen reader uses to describe images to blind and low vision users. OJS provides you with the opportunity to add alt text to any images when you insert or edit the image. As you can see in the screenshot here on the slide, you would enter alt text in that alternative description field. Any important text that is in an image should be represented in the alt text. And as Alexa said, you can think about the context of how the image is being used in OJS where you insert it. Similarly, images that function as links or buttons should have alt text that describes what will happen when a user clicks on it. In general, alt text should be concise. It should always end with punctuation, and it should give key information about the contents of the image. One exception to the rule about alt text is images that are merely decorative and don't convey any meaning. They're just there to look pretty. You don't need to and should not add alt text for those images in OJS. The next item on the checklist is descriptive links. So users who navigate with screen readers must be able to understand the purpose of a link so that they can skip the ones they're not interested in and click on the ones that they are. Often you'll see text on a website that says something like click here with click here hyperlinked. This is an example of what not to do because the words click here don't describe what the link is in any way. So instead of click here to read about our journal, a more accessible option would be more information is available on our About page with About page hyperlinked. There are a few other guidelines you can follow in linking text. Use keywords as link text rather than linking long sentences. Make links unique and avoid similarly named links if they go to different places. Finally, links should be visually distinct. Preferably just use that default blue underline style to set off your links from other text. Next, any content on a web page or in a digital document should be structured in a way that screen readers and other assistive technologies can easily navigate it. This means using well-structured HTML on web pages and the structured formatting tools available in Microsoft Word or other authoring software when composing digital documents. So some examples of these kinds of page structure items. First off, use headers to structure your web page or your document. In HTML, these are those H2, H3, etc. tags that indicate that text is a header. In Word or other word processing softwares, this means using the available heading formats and not just bolding and increasing font size for headers. Whether it's HTML or Microsoft Word, it's important not to skip header levels, meaning you don't want to nest an H4 header under an H2, even if you think it looks better on the page, because it may be confusing for screen reader users. Additionally, on web pages in OJS, you should never use the H1 header, as the theme already uses this header level for the page title. In addition to using headers, you should use appropriate HTML tags or word processing formatting for structured lists like bulleted lists or numbered lists. And you need to use appropriate table headers in any tables that you have. The OJS dashboard provides you with opportunities to add that structured HTML to the content that you add. In the screenshots on this slide, looking at that same description field as before, you'll see the formatting tools along the top of the text box, which you can use to format structured and unstructured lists. Additionally, the code icon, which looks like the less than greater than signs kind of smushed together, that presents you with the HTML source code for this content, where you can add header tags if you need them. Contrast and color are also vital to accessibility on the web. Having insufficient contrast may affect users with visual disabilities. Additionally, having content that relies solely on color to convey meaning may affect users with color vision deficiencies and those who rely on screen readers. As a result, you should never solely rely on color as the means of conveying information, for example, in pie charts. And you should always test colors for contrast to make sure that the contrast between background and foreground is sufficient. There are numerous free tools available for this purpose. We've linked to a few of these on the slide, and we'll share those in chat as well. Finally, don't forget about any of the documents published on your site. We're going to dive next into the editorial workflow, and we'll talk a lot more about PDF document accessibility there. But I'll just say now, you may have documents shared elsewhere in OJS, like the publisher library, and those documents must be accessible to users with disabilities as well. So now I'm going to hand it over to Mark Baggett from Texas A&M to walk us through embedding accessibility into the editorial workflow in OJS.
Thanks, Christy. So now that we've discussed how to make your web content accessible, let's take a closer look at how TDL hosted journals are currently doing in terms of PDF accessibility and steps we can take in our editorial workflows to ensure ADA Title II compliance. So in July 2025, we randomly sampled articles from the latest issues of TDL journals sponsored by Texas A&M University that were published as PDFs to assess the accessibility of the files and their editorial workflows. 3 articles were selected from each journal, and the files were tested against WCAG 2.1 AA standards. The results showed that none of the 51 articles available as PDFs were fully WCAG 2.1 AA compliant, indicating that these journals currently lack workflows to ensure ADA Title II compliance. So our study reviewed the articles for alignment with WCAG 2.1 AA standards and identified the most common accessibility barriers for the PDFs. The biggest issue we found was improperly configured article titles, affecting nearly 90% of the articles available. Missing alternative text for figures and images was also widespread, appearing in about 2/3 of PDFs. Other frequent problems that we found included tables, heading structure, and PDF reading order. These problems highlight the main areas where journal teams need to focus to ensure their final PDF galleys are ADA Title II compliant. So Christy mentioned this earlier, and even though it isn't formally part of the editorial process, accessibility compliance should start with the author's first draft. The more accessible that first draft is, the easier it's going to be for the journal team to produce a fully accessible final article. To support this, journals should have a clear accessibility policy and provide detailed author guidelines. These guidelines can encourage or even require authors to create accessible content from the start. For example, they can include instructions on how to create proper heading structure, descriptive figure captions, table formatting, and other key elements. In our recently released accessibility toolkit, we have developed a journal policy recommendation section to help teams communicate accessibility expectations to their authors, and we've shared that in the chat, and it's also available on this slide. So making authors initially responsible will make your compliance efforts much easier. To do this, authors should use proper document structure like structured headings, lists, and tables instead of doing manual formatting. Authors should provide images with alt text. Mathematical equations should be created with true equation editors rather than images of those equations. And meaning should never rely on color alone, as Christy mentioned earlier. These accessibility expectations also extend to any supplemental materials that might be available with your article galleys, such as data sets or other appendices. And file type is also important. Open formats like RTF can make it harder to create an accessible PDF, whereas formats like Microsoft Word provide clearer pathways to an accessible document. And for this reason, we recommend that authors be encouraged or even required to use Microsoft Word and saved items as Word documents prior to their initial submission. At every stage of the publishing process, from the author's initial draft through copy editing and section editing to the final galley production, everyone involved in this workflow should be using Microsoft Word's built-in accessibility checker. This tool highlights common accessibility issues, and requiring it at every stage helps catch problems early on. Doing so saves time, reduces the need for later remediation, and is a simple but effective way to ensure accessibility is maintained throughout the entire publishing workflow. We've shared a link in our accessibility toolkit to some information on how to use that we're pulling directly from PKP's accessible content website. So the external review process needs to maintain accessibility initialized by the author. Editorial staff preparing manuscripts for blind peer review should pay close attention that the removable of identifiable information does not break document structure, headings, alt text, or tables. Furthermore, you should never export to PDF for review copies as it could make that document inaccessible. For reviewers themselves, maintaining accessibility also matters. They should provide comments and feedback using built-in tools like track changes or word comments rather than other forms of editing. Feedback should be clear and descriptive so it can be understood by authors using assistive technologies. Finally, as stated previously, reviewers should run that built-in accessibility checker from Microsoft Word to ensure their feedback file remains accessible after the submission of the review. So during copy editing and production, accessibility depends heavily on the tool chain that you're using as part of your editorial workflow. If you're inserting images, figures, or tables at this section into the actual document, you must ensure those things are getting alt text. Editors should also ensure the document has proper structure with headings, lists, and logical reading order. Color and contrast should be carefully checked during this phase specifically because typesetting, design tweaks, and other aesthetic adjustments can change how text and graphics appear. Finally, as always, running an accessibility checker is an essential last step before the document goes into final production. And if you're using tools other than Microsoft Word during this phase, something like Adobe InDesign, you should use the accessibility tools built into those programs as well to ensure your final documents are still accessible. So when producing galley files in OJS, consistent labeling is essential. Each galley should be labeled by file type, for example, PDFs, so screen readers can announce the file types available correctly. The choice of file format also affects accessibility. Structured formats are the most accessible galley types because they preserve headings in the best way, alt text, and reading order. Because of this, we have included links in our toolkit for creating galleys in more structured formats like HTML, which we'll share in the chat and is available in the slide. And that part of the documentation is linked there. Finally, when generating PDFs from Word, you should never use print to PDF because it strips out all the accessibility tags you've worked so hard to maintain. And as always, you should run accessibility checkers on any galley files you create to ensure all the accessibility features you've worked so hard to create are being preserved. And now I'm going to turn it over to Susan, who's going to discuss how to ensure your OJS theme remains accessible.
Thank you, Mark. As Mark said, I'm going to be talking about theme accessibility. So as mentioned previously, TDL highly recommends that you use the default theme, which has been audited and revised for accessibility compliance. However, if you choose to use a theme other than the default, you need to be aware that journal teams are responsible for ensuring the accessibility of customized theming, including any modifications you make to the default theme. So in the same way that you make content accessible, you make themes accessible by using alt text, proper HTML markup, including structural elements such as headings, sufficiently contrasting colors, and vision-friendly fonts, and by properly labeling form elements such as edit boxes and buttons, and by using ARIA roles to advise the user's assistive technology. ARIA roles provide semantic meaning to content, allowing screen readers and other tools to present and support interaction with an object in a way that's consistent with user expectations of that type of object. ARIA roles can be used to describe elements that don't natively exist in HTML or that exist but don't have full browser support. So we've linked to the PKP theming guide in the chat. There are several tools that exist to help you develop and test your theme design for accessibility. Some of these are Wave, Lighthouse, and Axe Dev tools. Again, we've shared links to these tools in the chat. Also, your institution's accessibility office may be able to guide you to some available services. The next 3 slides briefly illustrate the user interfaces of these 3 tools. So this is Wave, and in this busy screen, you can see a report panel on the left and some icons that have appeared in the main panel. We'll demo Wave in a little bit. This is Lighthouse, which is an automated tool primarily for analyzing web page quality, but it can also be used to assess the accessibility of your journal site. And this is Axe Dev Tools, an automated accessibility checker from DQ. It's available for Chrome, Firefox, and Edge. And now we'll give a short demo of Wave.
Wave is a free web accessibility evaluation tool that helps web content developers identify areas that need to be made more accessible. To use the Wave browser extension, first navigate to the OJS journal page that you want to evaluate. Then, select the Wave evaluation tool from the list of extensions, which may look different in your browser. Wave uses icons to highlight the page elements that are relevant to the accessibility evaluation. Wave also summarizes its findings in a sidebar under 6 categories. Errors, which are failures of the WCAG requirements that will affect users. Contrast errors, where text and background do not meet WCAG contrast requirements. Alerts, which are page elements that may cause issues and will require human evaluation. Features, which are page elements that may improve accessibility if they are implemented correctly, for example, linked image with alt text. Structural elements shows page hierarchy, header structure, lists, frames, header and footer, and navigation order. ARIA lists areas of the page where ARIA has been used. 5 other tabs show additional information as you navigate through the evaluation results. 2 additional features to help you evaluate accessibility are the Styles toggle to view the page without the style sheet, and the Code Viewer to view the HTML source behind the page. With the Code Viewer on the Details tab, choose an item of concern and click its icon. Wave will scroll both the page and Code Viewers to display that page element. Click the icon in the Page Viewer for an explanation of the issue, with links to the code and a longer explanation and possible solutions on the Reference tab. There is far more to Wave than we can show in this short overview, so we have included several helpful resources in the slides.
And now I'll hand it over to Christy to wrap things up.
All right. Thanks, Susan, and thanks, everyone. We've spent some time going into, some level of detail about accessibility in OJS. So we want to take a minute to revisit and review our main recommendations to journal teams for moving toward greater accessibility of your sites. And we'll just start with a reminder that we highly recommend using the default theme. And if you use other themes or make changes, you need to test and remediate for web accessibility. And then in terms of content accessibility, we're recommending that you add web accessibility requirements to your author guidelines and other journal policies, that you embed web accessibility checks and remediation into every stage of your editorial workflow, and that you incorporate basic web accessibility practice into the creation of other content on your site. Doing these things, even imperfectly, will get us a long way towards drastically improved accessibility for users with disabilities and an improved user experience for all readers of your journals. We also want to say a final word about legacy content. So many of you have journals that have published for years and have a large archive of previously published issues. It may seem daunting to not just implement these practices going forward, but to also have to think about how to handle that legacy content. And we acknowledge that's a big issue, and we don't really have easy answers for this question. But here's our best non-legal advice for how to approach this. First and foremost, commit to ensuring that new content will be accessibility compliant. This is the most important step to stop, bad practice or imperfect practice and start good practice going forward. But second, we advise taking a look at the static content on your site, by which I mean those about the journal descriptions and policy language and other content that you've added in the journal settings in your OJS site, and make sure that that content meets accessibility guidelines with descriptive hyperlinks and alt text. Third, we recommend doing an inventory of existing articles and other files published on the site to get a sense of the scope of work in terms of what needs to be assessed and remediated. And this will allow you to create a plan to make those existing documents accessible over time. Finally, be ready to respond to individual requests for specific documents that aren't yet accessible, and prepare yourselves to remediate those upon request. We're putting a link in the chat to a blog post from an accessibility website that helped us think through some of these recommendations for dealing with legacy published content and documents, and that you may find helpful as well. As I mentioned before, this group of folks presenting in this webinar, the OJS Accessibility Users Group, has prepared a toolkit for journal managers and editors to help you navigate these accessibility guidelines. And the PKP, the Public Knowledge Project, who are the developers of the OJS software, have extensive documentation that we'll share links to in chat for creating accessible content and creating inclusive and accessible themes, and highly recommend that you use those as resources as well. The TDL member library that sponsors your journal is another resource for you, and we'll link to a page in our wiki that lists the library contacts at your institutions who you can reach out to with questions and support as well. And we also encourage you to reach out to your university accessibility office to inquire about support there for improving accessibility of content on your site. And with that, we have about 13 minutes left in the hour for your questions, and we invite you to either raise your hand and we can call on you, or enter your questions in chat. We'll do our best to answer them, and we've been tracking any questions that have been entered up to this point. We'll address those as well. While you're preparing your questions, I just want to thank everybody here for signaling your interest in and commitment to greater accessibility as evidenced by your participation here today. And remind you that the webinar is being recorded. We'll post the recording for your reference on the TDL YouTube channel later on. But for now, though, I'm going to stop the recording and we will have some discussion and take your questions.
Christy, we've got a lot of questions that we've
Oh,
got.
great.
In our Q&A doc. Do you want us to just kind of go through them in the order that they were asked, and then we'll just kind of add to them?
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. And I don't have that document open on my screen. So would you be willing to kind of read through and we can take them as they come?
Absolutely. So the first